Now, welcome to another lightning response video, where once again we're going to try to do a few questions here, and we're going to kick it off with this one from Artsman, who asked, "Hey Thor, got an Andor question for you. So I was thinking about Andor Season 2, great stories by the way, and I found what I think is a continuity issue. In the episode Messenger, we get that scene with the Force healer. Now, personally, I think it was a clever way of including the Force in Andor without sacrificing the more grounded tone the show has. However, as I thought about it, I noticed an issue. Cassian has been on Yavin for a few years by this point, right? How did he never run into Kanan or Ezra? Even if he never met them personally, you'd think someone from the Ghost crew like Hera or just someone who worked with them would have crossed paths with Cassian. I mean, he was kind of a rising star in the rebellion. How did he never meet or at least hear about the Jedi fighting with the rebellion? Would love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think with Andor and Rebels being so different, we kind of have to choose one over the other continuity-wise? Personally, I love both Rebels and Andor for different reasons, but even I'll admit they're so different tone-wise, it's hard to believe both occur in the same timeline. Just look at how the shows treat something simple like stormtroopers. Would love to hear your thoughts, and thanks for all the great Star Wars discussions you've given us. All right, so I'm going to start with the back half of the question or comment here about how Andor and Rebels have a very different tone. In fact, they couldn't feel any more different. I think they are on the opposite ends of the spectrum when it comes to tone. And like you, I very much enjoy both shows, and I understand why it feels like they aren't in the same universe or the same timeline or couldn't be covering sort of the same thing, the whole rebellion. But the way I look at it is, it's the intended audience that kind of separates them, where Rebels is clearly intended for a much, much younger audience. It is even rated Y7 or for 7-year-olds. And yes, I understand a lot of the people who watched it, myself included, are much older than 7 and still got enjoyment out of it. But when you consider the subject matter, and the example I always like to use is World War II. Let's say we made a show about World War II for 7-year-olds, which I'm sure would be just hugely popular and amazing with the ratings. I'm sure all kids would love to watch a World War II show. But if you did make a series about World War II for children, there are certain things you are not going to cover. And if you do cover them, you're going to water them down pretty heavily, right? You're not going to get into some of the details of World War II with a 7-year-old. And that's kind of how I feel about Rebels. You're not going to go into some of the things that, say, Andor went into when covering the Galactic Civil War. Basically, you're not going to focus on making the bad guys as terrifying as you possibly can, and as terrifying as they are. You're going to focus on making the good guys fun and heroic, and just making the whole thing fun. And maybe, if we are covering World War II, teaching kids a thing or two about it. Obviously, in Star Wars, it's all fictional, but you get my drift here. I just see it as two very different audiences, and you're going to cover the quote-unquote same story a different way depending on that audience. Now, going back to the first half of the question, how did Cassian never hear about Kanan or Ezra and the Force? Why is he so skeptical about the Force if he quite possibly ran into them, or at least ran into people who knew them? And this is a question I've covered before, and usually in regards to Luke. How did nobody, or how did some of the rebellion not hear about Luke? We had Cara Dune in The Mandalorian, had no clue who Luke was when he showed up in that famous episode in season 2 at the end of it. She seemed completely oblivious as to who he was and the Force and all of that, which I am kind of skeptical about. I would think his name, Luke's name, would have been all over the rebellion. Everybody would have been talking about him. He would have been a morale booster, right? The guy who blew up the Death Star, who is a Jedi, who uses the Force, all these things. Everybody would have been talking about him, theoretically. However, that doesn't mean everybody believes the stories. They could just think it's kind of rebel propaganda. Even if you're on the side of the rebels, you would probably understand you're going to do whatever you can to convince the rest of the galaxy to fight the Empire and to join your side. So you might embellish the stories about Luke Skywalker and what really happened at Yavin with the Death Star and all of that. And that's how I would answer the Cassian question. He's probably heard stories about Kanan and Ezra. Probably most rebels have heard about Kanan and Ezra, the return of the Jedi. But I don't know how much they believed it. And then there are probably people who still have doubts about the Jedi, about what happened way back in the day with the Clone Wars. They may still blame the Jedi for what happened, even though, yes, it's not like their fault. There's, again, a lot of propaganda involved from the Empire. And certainly at this point, there is a lot of skepticism about what really happened and how much the Jedi are to blame and how much Palpatine was to blame for what happened, or what he covered up, or what the story actually was. Anyway, it's a great question. I have certainly debated a lot about how much people did or didn't know about the Jedi at this point in time, how much they believed, again, the lies and propaganda of the Empire about them, how much they might still resent them for the Clone Wars and what happened after. It's hard to say. But almost certainly Cassian heard of the Jedi on their side, and probably since he already had a disposition not to really believe in the Force, as we saw with that really good Force healer scene. I agree that was the perfect way to kind of bring the Force very subtly into Andor. But he was very skeptical about the Force. He was probably very skeptical about the stories of Kanan and Ezra and what they might be doing. That's probably the best way to smooth out the continuity, shall we say. All right, the next question we have is then also sort of about Kanan, and part of the reason I picked these questions is Kanan is the character we are doing next in the Battle of the Heroes and Villains series. If you want to vote, there is a link to the poll or the comment in the description below. You can give him a grade, you can explain why you gave him that grade, and then in the coming days I will be doing that video. Either way, this question comes to us from Psychedelic Dude, who asked, "Hey Thor, is it always wrong to use the dark side? Let's create a scenario where it could be heroic to use the dark side." Imagine the year is 3 BBY, Kanan, Ezra, and the rest of the Ghost crew is on a space station after a battle. The space station is damaged and is going to crash or explode soon. There is only one escape pod left, enough room for all of them, but they are being hunted by Vader. They reach the pod, but Vader is right behind them. Now, let's say Kanan charges Vader with all his pent-up anger and hate, not to kill Vader, but to hold him off long enough for the others to escape. But he still uses the dark side to do it. But even if he was corrupted by the dark side, he will either be killed by Vader or die on the station anyways, still having saved others. Wouldn't that scenario make it okay or even good? And I certainly think intent has a lot to do with what makes something dark side or light side. There was another similar question that asked about using specific abilities and if they are dark side or light side abilities, how a force choke is technically just kind of force telekinesis, but you're using it to choke somebody. So what's the difference between the two in a manner of speaking? Anyway, as I was saying, I think it often comes down to intent. In the scenario you described, Kanan is giving his life. He is selflessly giving his life to save others. I mean, that's kind of how he already dies. Spoiler alert, I suppose. But certainly the intent behind the action is to save people. It is a good intent. It is a selfless intent. It is a light side intent. And honestly, I think when it comes to all of this, we could have some really great debates. And I think it's worth having the debate. Don't get me wrong. I'm not trying to push away the question because I don't know exactly how to answer it. But I do believe the intent behind Star Wars itself was for it to be more kind of simple. That the intent George Lucas had with all of this was to say, well, if you try to be selfless, that's good. And in general, when you are selfish, that's bad. And when you are selfish, it kind of spirals out of control a lot of the time. That's what falling to the dark side is, just embracing your selfish side all the time and never trying to think about others. And so, in other words, I think the message is a simple one, but the details can be very, very murky, which is why a lot of people do believe in things like Grey Jedi and think, well, that's probably the best way to do things, right? It isn't always a matter of like being selfless is always good and being selfish is always bad. I even argued that in the video I think you're probably referencing here, probably the question comes from, that being selfish is not always bad. There are certainly things we want and need in life and things we want to enjoy in life. We want to have a good life and we have to quote unquote selfishly take things to make that happen. Though we have to try to do it in a balanced way so that others are not going completely without because we wanted to have this one thing. Which again is how the dark side works. It's being so selfish that others are now going without because you need to have everything and you're so afraid to lose everything that you can't trust anybody. And so you're actually kind of tortured and miserable because you do nothing but fear losing everything you have. Whereas the light side is the idea that since I have nothing or very little, I only have the things I need. I don't really fear losing having nothing. And if I get extra, I'm going to share, and that brings me joy because I am a part of something bigger. It is symbiotic rather than parasitic like the dark side. And I know I go into all this stuff all the time, but I do find the basic idea of Star Wars, the dark versus the light, selfless versus selfish. I find it fascinating and completely on point, but I will admit that when you get into the nuance, when you get into the details of it, it doesn't always work perfectly. In reality, it's meant to be a basic life lesson for young people. I think we always have to keep that in the back of our mind, even though, again, I love to discuss all of this at great length. I think it can work and does work as a sort of guideline for how you should live your life. Yes, try to be more selfless, try to be less selfish, and you will find balance and you will be a part of something bigger than just hoarding everything for yourself and being a selfish darksider. All right, well, I think that is going to be all I got for you this time. Hopefully it didn't sound like I was trying to deflect that question too much. Again, it's a good question. It's a hard question. I don't think that if you do one bad thing, you automatically fall to the dark side, assuming you're a Force user. I mean, we even see Anakin doing plenty of bad things during his lead up to his final fall. He murders Tuskens. He does other bad things along the way, and that doesn't cause him to immediately fall. So even in that regard, there is a gray area here. Not that I like to use that word in reference to Star Wars, but you get what I'm saying here. But anyway, excellent questions. There were a ton of other excellent questions, but as always, I can't get to them all. I do feel bad because sometimes there's some really good ones and I just never get to them. But if you want to ask them again, like I always say, you can ask them again. Just take to the comments below, start your comment off with a Haith, or either ask a previous question, ask a new question. I will try to answer it in a future video. But whatever the case may be, leave your comments below. Let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.